After Judah's best king, Hezekiah, we are now treated to Judah's worst, Manasseh. Verse 1 gives the length of his reign at a surprising 55 years, where we might expect it to be considerably shorter, given how evil he was. But, as we all know, there are times when the Lord does allow evil to prosper and linger, and we must trust his deep justice. From a political point of view, Manasseh's reign survived three of the most powerful Assyrian kings, Sennacherib, Esarhaddon, and Ashurbanipal. At one point, under these kings, the Assyrian Empire controlled all of Mesopotamia, Egypt, and everything in between. There are Assyrian inscriptions which describe Manasseh as loyal, meaning he did not rebel as Hezekiah did in 18:7. Manasseh's reign was simultaneously the most evil and, at least in political terms, the most peaceful. But verse 16 records that on top of all the raging idolatry he committed, including child sacrifice, he also filled Jerusalem from one end to the other with blood. The Talmud has the tradition that this included the blood of Isaiah, and Josephus also writes in his History of the Jews that Manasseh killed the prophets, though he does not mention Isaiah. The narrator of 2 Kings shows that Manasseh went out of his way to not only undo all the reforming good work of Hezekiah, but to pile up as much evil as he could think of. Every kind of idolatry and sorcery is invested in, and altars and graven images are set up in the temple and its courts. I can imagine him sitting on his palace roof of an evening and tapping his teeth thoughtfully, wondering if there was any other way left to him by which he might anger God. In verse 10, the Lord responds via unnamed prophets. Micah and Isaiah had ceased their prophetic ministry before Hezekiah died, and Jeremiah and Zephaniah commenced theirs during Josiah's reign, which follows. Thus there was a 55-year silence during Manasseh's reign, at least from the biblical prophets. There may still have been a guild. But whoever the Lord spoke by, this is the last straw. In verse 11, he reveals that now Manasseh has managed to achieve a historic level of evil, surpassing that of the Amorites, a summary term referring to the peoples which Israel displaced from Canaan. Now, in particular, in verses 12 and 13, the Lord declares that Judah is to suffer the same fate as Samaria. The imagery of the plumb line, which we saw in Amos 7, is applied here. Then he uses the image of wiping a bowl or plate clean and turning it over to wipe the underside too. It implies complete destruction. He even says in verse 14 that he will cast off his heritage. The covenant is broken. Judah is thrown away. We are by now somewhat used to the language of judgment, especially as far as we have read in the Minor Prophets, but we should not miss this moment. This is the big break. This is the moment the Lord has decided to destroy Judah. This is underlined in 23, 26 to 27, where Manasseh is again blamed for provoking the Lord to judgment. Babylon is not mentioned here, just the general term enemies, but Isaiah did predict to Hezekiah in 20:17 to 18 that it would be Babylon who would carry off the wealth of his palace and some of his own sons too. Manasseh's son Ammon carries on his father's evil and is thankfully assassinated. He is replaced by Josiah, who represents another high point in the history of the kings. Verse 2 of chapter 22 summarized Josiah as being wholehearted and obedient to the Lord, using the language of the law, as he turns neither to the right or to the left. His reforms will come in the next chapter. Josiah begins to reign aged 8, but the narrative skips straight to when he is 26 and begins repairs on the temple. This is 90 years after Jehoash repaired it, after the evil queen Athaliah. This act of piety and respect leads to the discovery of a book, meaning a scroll, which is called the Book of the Law, in verse 8. It might be Deuteronomy, or an earlier version of Deuteronomy. In Deuteronomy 31:24-26, Moses is described as finishing writing down all this teaching and then telling the Levites to put it next to the ark as a witness against them. There is a rabbinic tradition that when the scroll was found, it was lying open at Deuteronomy 28:36, which explains Josiah's reaction in verse 11. Josiah is keenly aware of Judah's feelings as revealed by this book, and so now he wants to check the Lord's mood, which ought to be dire by now. The prophetess Huldah is an unknown figure and may have been a court prophet like Nathan was to David. Jeremiah and Zephaniah were now active at this time, but perhaps they were elsewhere, or perhaps it was simply more natural to turn to the court prophet first. Huldah delivers two oracles. The first confirms Josiah's worst fears. God is not only angry, he has already decided the judgment, and it will not be stopped. The second oracle, however, offers some consolation. The Lord has taken account of Josiah's penitence and humility, and for that he will, like Hezekiah, be spared the horrors to come. The note about dying in peace refers only to Josiah dying before the destruction of Judah, which the end of the oracle indicates. He will in fact die in battle. We are now very much at the beginning of the end of the monarchy, but at least with Josiah and his reforms in the next chapter, we have more than a glimmer of faithfulness and righteousness from one of the last Judean kings.